Did you see my conversation with a guy named Nate when we talked about consciousness? Did you see that?
I saw clips for that too. I haven't watched the full episode in quite some time, but I've been digging the shorts.
That is disappointing, but
yeah, that's pretty much where I'm at just in general. I've been watching a lot. Like, it's really bad. My brain is... They should, like, you remember that ad for, it's like, this is your brain on drugs. And it's like the deflated kid on the couch, you know? You ever seen that?
No.
Well, they should do an ad campaign of this is your brain on, you know, short form content.
Mm.
And it's just like, it's just a short form content though. That's the crazy part. And then it's just like one of those toxic, like, you could tell like a 12-year-old made the meme because it's like way overstimulated.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
That'd be a great ad campaign. Anyways,
You should be,
I haven't.
that should be your job.
Yeah. No, dude. I'll just give it, that'll be like my my end of the year assignment for my students, where it's like, all right, make the most overstimulating, just hype. I don't know what even words they would use. Brain rot? I guess brain rot. Make the most brain rot. Dude, they'd eat that up.
They would. They would.
Oh gosh. It might be a good idea.
All right, folks, strap in for an hour and a half to 2 hours of the opposite of brain rot.
Hopefully.
Habitable order out of chaos at the beginning of time, which is roughly the right way of thinking about it, seems to me deeply allied with the idea that what it is that we do as human beings is encounter something like a formless and potential chaos. I mean, we're not omniscient, obviously, and we can't just do whatever we want, but we encounter a formless and chaotic potential. That's always what we're grappling with, and somehow we use our consciousness to give that form. And this is how people act. Like, if you look at how they regard themselves, it's how they act. Because you say things to people like, well, you should live up to your potential. And you make a case that there's something about a person that's more than what is, that yet could be if only they participated in the process properly. And everyone knows what that means, and no one acts like a mystery has been uttered when you say that. And you know, you can see a situation in your own life that's full of potential. You're often extremely excited when you encounter something that's full of potential, because what you see is something that could be. You see a future beckoning for you that could be if only you interacted with it properly. And it.
All right. So for this lecture, Jordan is dealing with the first lines of Genesis. So he says, in the beginning, the earth was formless and void, and the Spirit of God hovered over the waters. And I don't think he's quite there yet. He's sort of setting all of that up in the lecture. But he is, in this particular instance, referring to God as consciousness. And this is part of a series of comparisons, or I don't know what you'd call it. It's like his attempt to create a mosaic, a collage of different instances where you feel like you can see God at work in the biblical stories. And so this is synchronous with his way of viewing the biblical stories as snapshots of God interacting with his people throughout history, in order for they're written down and compiled in order for us to grasp God's character in some form or fashion. And so here he gets into something that is very important for pretty much the rest of like this episode that you're listening to right now, because it's a core idea that is referred to in the beginning of the Bible, that human beings are created in the image of God. And so right in the very beginning, what is the image of God that we have? And Peterson identifies some consilience here with consciousness, God as consciousness. And that's already an interesting topic for a whole podcast in and of itself. But then two, I think right here, addressing the formless and void world or the material world as though it has potential, and addressing yourself to it in such a way as to be excited about that potential and be a part of the process of drawing out that potential, actualizing it, materializing it. And so, anyway, I just thought that was a good place to kick off for a bunch of fun stuff. I have plenty more clips, but do you have anything to say?
I feel targeted. I feel like you gave me only 30 seconds because I was telling you about the YouTube Shorts addiction that I'm struggling with currently.
Well, you wanted more. If that's what you're saying. We can play it. We could keep it rolling for a second.
Yeah. I feel like we should.
Activates your nervous system, right, in a very basic way. And we even understand how that happens to the degree that we understand how the nervous system works, because the systems that mediate positive emotion, which are governed roughly by the neurochemical dopamine, and which have their roots way down in the ancient hypothalamus, a very, very archaic and fundamental part of the brain, that responds to potential, which is the possibility of accruing something new and valuable. It responds to potential with active movement forward and engagement. And so we're engaged in the world as potential, and it looks like consciousness does that. And so there's this idea that, and this is the main idea that I think is being put forth in Genesis 1. It's something like, and you see this in mythology, like from what I've been able to gather, there's always three causal elements that make up being at the bottom of world mythology. And one is the formless potential that makes up being once it's interacted with, and that's generally given a feminine nature. And I think that's because it's like the source from which all things emerge and rise. It's something like that. It's more complicated than that, but it's something like that. And then there's some kind of interpretive structure that has to grapple with that formless potential. And I think that's the sort of thing that was alluded to by Immanuel Kant when he was criticizing the notion that all of our information comes from sense data, which would be the pure empirical perspective, right? Because when you encounter the world, you encounter it with a cognitive structure that already has shape. And so it's already in you, this structure. And without that a priori structure, you wouldn't be able to take the formless potential and give it structure. And I think that's something, it's akin in some way to the idea of God the Father, and I'll try to develop that idea more. It's the notion that there's something in all of us that transcends all of us, that's deeply structural, that's part of this ancient, well, I would say evolutionary and cultural process that enables us to grapple with the formless potential and bring forth reality, roughly speaking. And then there's the final element, and that element seems to be something like consciousness itself, the consciousness that actually inheres in the individual. So it's not only that you have a structure, it's that the structure has the capacity for action in the world. And it's like, you're the spirit that gives the dead structure life. It's something like that. And as far as I can tell, the Trinitarian notion that characterizes Christianity is something like, well, formless potential, which is never given the status of a deity in Christianity. And then the notion that there's an a priori interpretive structure that's a consequence of our ancient existence as beings. It goes back as far in time as you can go, the notion of a structure. And then the idea of a consciousness that is the tool of that structure and that interacts with the world and gives it reality. And that's the Word, as far as I can tell. And so the notion is that there's a Father, and that's the structure, and there's a Son that's transcendent, that characterizes consciousness itself, and that it's the Son, the speaking of the Son, that is the active principle that turns chaos into order. And God, it's such a sophisticated idea as far as I'm concerned.
That was really good. I find that interesting about I was having a conversation last night, mostly just, it was like the first conversation in quite some time where I was able to like actually just express with somebody where I'm at. And I was coming off of, I had to do this midterm for a class I'm taking, and the midterm was mostly just a bunch of prompts There's like 12 questions, so you have to use at least 200 words to answer or whatever. And so, and a lot of those questions, the class is like the fundamentals of faith or whatever. And it felt like mostly just journaling, which was good. It took me 3 hours, which was probably the longest time I spent on something for that amount of time consecutively, other than video games in the last week and a half, which was good. It was very sobering. But I've been recognizing, I don't know, just in the last week and a half in particular, I came back from this trip and now I'm back in Silver City and I don't have the daily routine of like going to class and having a dedicated group to spend every day with. And it just feels like my days are I don't see the potential of the days, and been getting my dopamine fix, I guess, of like with video games, it's like every single game is like it's like something new can happen. And so it's like a simulated place of control where I can, it's so weird. Yeah. Like participate in I like the way that he's describing it, like having the potential of the chaos and then having a structure and then your spirit, which gives life to the structure. So you can like shape the potential to something, fashion it in a way that is pleasing and good. And how I feel like I've been simulating that, but in a realm that is just has no true consequence in the real world. And so rather than being excited by the potential of the day in a concrete sense, I've been simulating it as a coping mechanism.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's like getting dopamine hit, but then there's like no actual, I guess, dividends from the investment of time. It has no true implications for the real world other than just leaving me with a lot of brain fog and a sense of dissatisfaction because of how unproductive I have been. And so, yeah, just recognize I need more structure. But I guess it's like the way he's talking about it is making me think like, in a sense, the structure is already there, which is interesting to think about. So it's like trying to get your external reality to be in conformity to the internal reality,
Yes.
I don't know if that's the right way to articulate it, but
Absolutely. Yeah, I've been thinking about this a lot recently because I came at it from a different angle, the question of authority. And I've had conversations with a new friend via the phone. So we've been chatting for probably 11 or 12 hours altogether over the course of our young friendship. But he's Eastern Orthodox and somewhat newly, like not born into that, but he converted. And so we were talking about this question of authority. And it's very interesting to me because I often wonder what it even means that someone would be your spiritual authority. And this is a claim that all like pastors, preachers, priests like make or have in the lives of the people that are, I don't know what you say, following them or whatever, like being a part of their spiritual program. And so authority comes up and he runs through apostolic succession, which I just didn't know about. Like I had heard the term and I was familiar with the concept in general, but to hear him just like break it down as someone who believes in that, I was like, huh, wow, yeah, that is airtight. Like I basically have nothing to criticize about that argument. But it was that helped me kind of shine the light on like, oh yeah, so what do I think authority is or how it comes about? Because basically, his claim is that it's he's getting this from D.C. Schindler, who I wanted to go to next in my little ramble here. Schindler says that authority is true witness, and I think that is an absolutely beautiful understanding of the concept of authority. We tend to think of authority in terms of this dead structure. There's a clip later in the show that I definitely will play before we're done that talks about confusing the transcendent with the structure that is manifest in the world. And so like the government or the king being confused with God. And so when you confuse the king with the ideal, you limit the ideal all the way down to the king, and then everything just dies because there isn't anything sustaining it. And so I think that authority is essentially the communication of the transcendent into whatever embodied situations we find ourselves in. And so that language is actually open enough for me, and this is only a few sentences here and there out of, I think it's just an essay that Schindler did, so not even any of his books. He's a philosopher, so lots of words to describe why it is he thinks that authority is this way or that way. He's also a Catholic, so the apostolic succession thing holds true for him. It just takes a different shape at a certain point in history. But what's interesting to me is, like, even as a Protestant, I still sense like the capacity. I would just argue that there are people who are in communication with that transcendent spirit that is the structure. And so when you talk about becoming aligned with that spirit, I think that is what I see in Christianity. Like, I see the goal as being born again and sharing a life, sharing the space of your body with the divine spirit, such that the structure you've been given physically, and even spiritually and mentally and all of these things would be inhabited by, like, co-inhabited by you and the Spirit of God in such a way that you approach the world as that word. In the beginning was the word, and then in you is the word, and then you're able to approach the world, like faithfully, like moving mountains and stuff, because you see the potential and you have relationship with that word.
Yeah, it's like you're actually participating in the purpose that you are fashioned to live out, being made in the image of God.
Yeah. It is like that. All right. You good to move on?
Let's do it.
Okay.
But it's not also obvious to me why people would come up with that concept, because I don't really think that when we think about each other, we immediately think God-like. The notion that every single human being, regardless of their peculiarities and strangenesses and sins and crimes and all of that, has something divine in them that needs to be regarded with respect and that plays an integral role, at least an analogous role, in the creation of habitable order out of chaos. That's a magnificent, remarkable, crazy idea. And yet we developed it, and I do firmly believe that it sits at the base of our legal system. I think it is the cornerstone of our legal system. That's the notion that everyone is equal before God, which is, of course, that's such a strange idea. It's very difficult to understand how anybody could have ever come up with that idea, because the manifold differences between people are so obvious and so evident that you could say the natural way of viewing someone or human beings is in this extremely hierarchical manner, where some people are contemptible and easily brushed off as pointless and pathological and without value whatsoever, and all the power accrues to a certain tiny, aristocratic minority at the top. But if you look at the way that the idea of the individual sovereignty developed, it's clear that it unfolded over thousands and perhaps 10,000s of years before it became something firmly fixed in the imagination that each individual had something of transcendent value about them. And man, I tell you, we dispense with that idea at our serious peril, And so, and if you're going to take that idea seriously, then, which you do because you act it out, because otherwise you wouldn't be law-abiding citizens, right? You act that idea out. It's firmly shared by everyone who acts in a civilized manner. The question is, why in the world do you believe it, assuming that you believe what you act out, which I think is a really good way of fundamentally defining belief. So, all right, so...
Two things there. One, that is the classic. It's one of his greatest hits, like that you act out what you believe. And that concept, I'm calling this series Reviewing the Genesis Lectures. And for me, I came across the Genesis Lectures at the tail end of a debaucherous period of hedonism in my life. And I was searching for something better and more integrated, like where I could be myself and be proud of it, in a way where, like in John, it says, the light came into the world and the world hated, or the darkness hated the light because its deeds were evil. I felt like I was at that point in my life of just like not wanting at all to be associated with who I was. And so then I wanted to become something different. And I think it's so interesting because what I wrestled with most deeply when I was coming to terms with who I was and what I did, like actively, what I was doing, and the fact that who I was seemed to not be liking that very much. I was coming to grips with the fact that like I had to do something different, but I was also coming into contact with Christianity that was sort of like, yeah, so you just gotta believe. And like I had a lot of good conversations with my mom, but there wasn't like there wasn't anything necessarily to do. Like there wasn't an easy on-ramp because my parents aren't going to tell me like, just say a prayer, if you say a prayer, then you'd be good. But so there's somewhere in between the say a prayer people and the become a Catholic, become an Orthodox, like live the rest of your life in devotion to this liturgy and God through the liturgy, etc. And so that was a very interesting experience for me to try to wrestle through that. But then the other thing is I just want to talk about the concept of individual sovereignty. It is so fascinating to me to even like try to conceive of a world before individual sovereignty. We just can't even, I'll speak for myself. That is a very difficult exercise in imagination. The other day, I was listening to this lecture like a few weeks ago, and a lady needed me to help her put something in her car. And it was like right after I heard this part, and I was like, "Oh yeah, that's super funny. Like she shouldn't trust me to, I've got her by 100 pounds and 8 inches, and I could not abide by the law, and that would put her in serious danger. But she just assumes, and she should, like that I'm just going to treat her respectfully as another sovereign individual, and just give her a hand loading her truck with this case of water bottles, Yeah, no problem. I got that for you. But of course, like there's, the meme, there's this meme that goes around whenever there's a Nordic individual on Twitter, and it's like, this is the last thing that you would see before the Vikings killed you or whatever. And it's really funny because it's like, you don't think about, it's this guy from Norway in the World Cup, Erling Haaland, and he's like the best soccer player in the world. He's 6'4", shredded, like way beefier than you'd imagine a soccer player could ever be, and he just scores goals. But a long time ago, he would have ripped your head off, and done unspeakable things to everyone in your family. And that's just the way it was. There was no there wasn't a like, hey, another World Cup thing is the U.S. had a guy that accidentally stepped on the heel of another guy, and he got a red card for it, and he got suspended. And then FIFA was like, no, that's not right. He shouldn't have been suspended. So they pulled it back. And that's not a thing. Like they shouldn't have pulled it back, but they just decided it didn't look fair to the world, so they scaled it back. That there were no VAR replays for the Vikings, right? They just came in and they killed you, and that was the way it was. And that was recently. That's like 1100s, 1200s, something like that. So it's a big change. That's what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, I like how he incorporates that it is in the imagination. This I guess it's like a presupposition, like to presuppose that people ought to be treated with dignity and to trust that they will reciprocate the respect for God-given dignity. That is like it is a presupposed reality. It is that a priori structure, or at least part of it, I think.
It's the treat other people the way that you want to be treated. This is why that's the a priori structure that you can attach what Jesus says to. Like it's that level of integrated to the individual. You see what I'm saying? Like there's a transformation that Christians speak of and indicate in the scripture and then all through the tradition that we understand doesn't mean like that your name necessarily changes or that your self changes, although the name change thing is a big deal for a lot of versions of the tradition because it's that fundamental of a change. But I'm trying to say, like, you are conscious the entire time. Like you are present for the before times and the after times. And so when Jesus says like you must be born again, that's a big shift in consciousness, I think, that he's referring to there. And then also he will say like, and treat other people the way that you want to be treated. And that's like, what that means. That stays with you across before being born again and after being born again.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's described as being a new creation. Yeah, it's regeneration. So it's like you're generated again, which implies that you're once this I guess this aspect of you was once alive, but then lost power and then it's regenerated to where like the systems are back online type of thing, or the structure is actually yours again. I find that fascinating. Um, and how it is tied, I do think it is tied to innocence, where it's like, you're kind of born with an innate faith in humanity, but then somewhere along the way, your experience gives your imagination new fuel and then new presuppositions to work with, rather than presupposing that, um, you know, people are safe. You can experience things that rob you of that, and then gives your imagination new fuel because you experienced a human being who was not safe, and then you then project that upon humanity as a whole.
Yeah.
Which is not a blamable thing, I don't think. I think that's understandable and natural. And it does take a supernatural thing to restore the innocence that is lost, or at least the state of innocence that enables you to entertain the imaginations of is it benevolence, I suppose?
Yeah, as opposed to the malevolence that you've experienced.
Yeah. And then kind of assume is going to happen again at the hands of any and everybody, depending on how severe the trauma was or egregious the offense was.
Yeah. We've got a clip about that coming up. Stay tuned.
when you think about it too, we tend to think that what you encounter when you're looking at the world is the material world, but that isn't how you act. You do act as if you're in a place of potential, and also in a place of potential that you can actually transform, which is also something extraordinarily strange, you know, because we do treat each other as if we're capable of bringing new forms into the world in some permanent manner, right? And we treat each other as if we have free choice and free will, and perhaps we don't. But it's certainly the case that societies that are predicated on the idea that we don't do very well. And societies that are predicated on the idea that we do seem to do a lot better. Plus, people tend to get very annoyed at you if you treat them like they're automatons that lack free will. There's something that people find very, I would say, constraining, slave-like about that even. You know, that the demand that you don't have actual autonomy, and even worse, that you're not responsible for your choices. It's an insult to someone to suggest to them that they're not responsible for their choices. You know, you usually, to do that to someone from a legal perspective, you have to argue something like diminished capacity, right? Well, you're mentally ill, or you don't have the intellectual capacity, or you were addled by some substance, or you had a brain injury or something, and that's why you're not responsible for your actions. Otherwise, part of the respect that you give to another human being is the assumption that they're responsible for their actions. And some of that can be, well, if you do something bad, then you're responsible for it. But part of that too is that if you do something good, you're also responsible for that. And that also seems necessary because, I mean, do you really, I mean, it's got to be more annoying than anything else you can imagine to strive virtuously, let's say, to produce something of extreme value and then to be treated as if that was a mere deterministic outcome and that your actual choices had nothing to do with that. I mean, people find that sort of thing extraordinarily punishing. And so I'm willing to, you know, I mean, I know that there are debates about all these things and debates about free will and debates about the nature of consciousness, but I'm trying to take a clear look at how people act and how they want to be treated, and then to trace it back to these old ideas to see if there's some metaphysical, let's say, metaphysical connection.
Yeah, man. Me too. I was just thinking so much about this. I was hooked at this point. I already did an episode about the way that, or about the introduction of this lecture series, and I've watched all of these multiple times, and this is just another good section for reminiscing about good old JBP. I was thinking about what do you call it? Psychotherapy, and it's ironic because Jordan is a therapist, and he tries to do it well. And okay, so I'm thinking two things. One is 12 Rules for Life was a book that changed the world. You know, 22 million, or maybe less than that, 11 million copies sold at some point, and I've seen that on the cover of the book. But I'm sure there's even more millions of copies sold of that book. People found it radical. But I have friends. Dave is our friend, and he would just say like when his sons came to him, like, Dad, this guy is so cool, Jordan Peterson, you got to check him out. He was like, I told you guys to do that stuff the whole time. Like I raised you that way,
Yeah.
and it's so simple and straightforward, and it is. But like everything he just laid out there it's addressing the fact that we try to get out of responsibility for our actions. And one of the clearest ways that I see that we do that is through social media. Another way might be like psyops and conspiracy theories. You know, like people who are conspiracy theorists tend to think that they're sort of awake to the situation. They know what's going on, and so therefore they can be responsible for their actions. But everyone else is just being duped by these people, you know? And anyway, the therapy angle would just be you go and you tell them the things that are wrong with you, and they'll tell you, like, it's because of your mother, it's because of your father, it's because of your family dynamics, it's because of not getting enough attention or not getting enough love, or, you know, all of these different things, and that's why you're doing the things that are wrong with you. And it's like, if you just stop there and there's no repair of the things that are broken in you from these situations. It can be totally legitimate that those are the causes. But if you don't take responsibility back on, and this is a classic Peterson thing too, like you gotta do the next step that you're capable of, the zone of proximal development. You have to, if you're scared of elevators, you got to go to a building that has an elevator and look at it, And if you can't go in, then just look at it and walk away, and then come back and then go push the button. If you can't get in, then you push the button and walk away. And then the next time, it's the exposure therapy idea that is necessary as a conclusion of the discovery of these things, because there are lots of outside influences on our lives. But to say, well, I can't do anything other than this, it's something, man. To me, it seems like it's a very dangerous way to obfuscate your your personhood. All of a sudden, when you push away your responsibility for things, you start to not exist anymore. And so I think that he said it's an extremely punishing thing to live in a world trying to do good things, but only being uncredited for these accomplishments because, well, that's just the way that it would have happened. I also see in that a lot of identity politics and intersectionality and all of that stuff. Like, well, yeah, it makes sense because you're a white guy, you're straight, everybody's rooting for you, you come from money, and so obviously, you're privileged, and it would have happened that way. But then you've got other people that are a different example, and their things don't line up with the outcomes. There's plenty of white privileged people that totally fail at living a meaningful or successful life. And there's plenty of, success stories from the underprivileged or the unprivileged categories that we might make up. And it just seems so nihilistic. At least it produces nihilism in me to think like, well, it just can't be any other way because of the way that I am, my family, my money, whatever.
Yeah, I think that's why this is a very fresh take, because he's already, well, not even he is. It's the Bible has it completely. Well, the popular consensus, not that I can really speak for the psychological psychologists and their schools of thought, but I think it was Carl Rogers. I don't really remember exactly which popular thinker cultivated the trending consensus upon a fundamental belief about humanity, which was really the blank slate hypothesis, that we're all born as blank slates, and then our external circumstances shape who we are. Even what Jordan Peterson is addressing here, the way he's articulating the presuppositions that the Bible gives you concerning humanity, is that we're not born as blank slates. We're born with a structure. We're born with a, just with a prior commitment to, or just an innate commitment to a whole array of imaginations and assumptions and thoughts, because it stems from, it's what's in the mind of God. And so it's like, these are God's thoughts. And so therefore he instilled in us ideals and ideas and ways of thinking that, is part of our genesis. That I do think the blank slate argument is a factor to consider, though, but not in the sense of like a truly blank slate, but in the fact that we're born with an innate, I'm trying to think of a better way to word it. I guess just value structure. Maybe that's a good way to put it. Can
I just say a value structure is extremely perceptual, because I was going to say, I'm thinking of my sister who she's the youngest sister, and she is left-handed and more creative than anyone that I've ever met, and she is like kind of way out there. Like she just is not on the same wavelength as everybody else, and not in a intelligence way. She's equally or greater intelligence to most of us, and me included. I said most of us. I felt like I was like, well, not me. Anyway, so she's like she's different than me, you know, and it's not just experiences. You know what I'm saying? Like if you separated us all at birth and gave us somehow, you know, in this experiment, like the same exact upbringing, obviously it wouldn't be the same, but and we didn't grow up together, I'm saying, and shape each other as siblings, as parents, and whatever. It's like we wouldn't just have an inherent, there wouldn't be identical inherent structure. You know what I mean? And this is what he was saying was so interesting about the way that we identified the, I don't know what the word is, the universality of the sovereignty of the individual. Like how can you can't even barely tell that we're all the same creatures, you know? Like people are so different, and obviously so, that how could you even assume that there is anything universally valuable across the board? And that's why we tend towards hierarchies to sort of eliminate the need for identifying this value in each person. But what I'm saying is my sister is incredibly valuable, and her perspective is incredibly different than mine. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I think that gives credence to the thought that like you are the consciousness that it gives power to the structure. Not that the structure is a living thing, but you are the thing that animates the structure. Something like that. But I mean, the other thing that this segment prompted in my mind was in terms of like the responsibility factor and us viewing other people as responsible for the good or the bad that they do. It made me think of, well, I've been, in light of that paper How to Write and thinking about faith and all of that, there was like a question of like, why does faith demand works? And it led me to the saying that Jesus says, you know, like you are the light of the world. Therefore, you know, the whole don't put your light under no one puts a lamp under a bushel. And so therefore practice your good deeds in a way that men will see your good works and glorify your Father in heaven. To introduce that thought to this conversation is interesting because as I'm saying it, it's even like it doesn't eliminate the fact that you're responsible for your choices, but it also does point to the fact that like ultimately God is responsible for empowering you to take the responsibility of bearing another's burden, which is a good work.
Yeah. I was going to say that's the thing that atheists see more clearly than believers, I feel like. And maybe I'm wrong about that. They see what you just said very obviously, and then I don't know that they know God in any type of relational way. I don't even mean anything super spiritual about that. I just mean like they definitely don't trust God at the, you know, maybe by virtue of their atheism. But they identify the issue with the fact that God is the one, he's the ground of being, and so then it's his fault, right? Like that is the argument for the problem of evil. Is like he's the one that could solve this problem. Like even you were saying it at a deeper level of like he's the one that gives you the power to carry out the good work that he desires to work in you. And that's something that you're pulling from Philippians. Like that's in the Bible, and that's the way that we think about it. So anyway, I just was identifying like there's that squirrely problem, that problem
Of
of evil.
agency.
Yeah. Um, I feel like I don't have anything to jump off of with the problem of evil for what I've been thinking about recently, but they feel related to me because I've been thinking about how it is that we are born again and what it is that's shifting around or changing in us at that time. And basically, been touching on from different vectors, like the idea of God indwelling a person and how that's associated with having a relationship with God, Jesus in my heart, that sort of thing. But it seems to me that it isn't just like, obviously it's not just a moral code, right? That was attempted in the Old Testament. And it's definitely something of the order of a spiritual relationship. This is indicated all across the New Testament. Anyway, I shouldn't have said anything because I felt like I couldn't connect them, but I feel like this problem of agency is the problem of evil, but also it's the way that I see Christ in me and my relationship with Jesus and how I follow him. It's a process of holding his hand, not not watching the game tape and trying to imitate him, isolated from him. Right? It's a close proximity sort of situation.
Yeah. But the side of it that this prompted was thinking of being an agent of good where others can see your works and recognize that, oh, this person's responsible for affecting my life beneficially in this way. It kind of gives them, well, I guess it just gives them hope.
Mm-hmm.
And just, I don't know, just thinking about that, like even with my students this last year, it's just thinking about that, like how, they come from various households and they have experienced various ill willed individuals who have impacted and shaped their perception of, well, pretty much the whole world, but namely humanity. Um, and so it's like having people that, they're responsible for this bad thing that happened, but then to be a figure that's like, oh no, someone actually was also responsible for benefiting me genuinely, gives them more fuel for their imagination to work with, which I think is an aspect of the whole, like,
It's called hope.
yeah, but like how when you you give them hope, which then gives them something to put their faith in. I mean, that's the nature of faith, right? Faith is the evidence of things unseen, the substance of things hoped for. And so it's like you give them a substantial reason to believe that it could be better, which is what he's saying here. It's like that in every single human being, we have the ability to actually affect permanent change in the real world through taking responsibility and generating a good work uh, by deciding to act upon presuppositions and to act upon hope. Like, yeah, there's that element of like, I don't see it yet, but I can be the vehicle that substantializes this hope.
Incarnates.
Yeah. I find that very fascinating. It's just this whole, how much tacking onto that. That's why I think when he mentioned that it's in the imagination, um, these beliefs and these innate structures, when it is an active part of your imagination and your surmisings that it will lead you to playing a role in substantiating, incarnating the hope in another's life, and which can actually permanently bring about change. Because you're just giving people more fuel to work with and reasons to believe in something they haven't seen before. But that goes both ways.
Yeah.
It's, if you do evil, then it's like, well, I haven't seen horrible things, but I know it's possible. And I guess that's this whole time it's seeing the with this whole potential concept, how it can cut both ways, and it does cut both ways in the Genesis story.
Yeah.
So being a vehicle of regeneration, it's a fascinating idea.
You can see that, for example, with what happened with eBay, which I think was a kind of miracle, because what should have happened with eBay was that you sent me junk and I sent you a check that bounced, right? And that was the end of eBay. But right, exactly. But that isn't what happened. Like the default transaction on eBay was so honest that the brokers, you could hire brokers to begin with. I can't remember what they were called exactly, but you could pay someone a fee so that they would guarantee the transaction. So, you wouldn't send me junk and I'd actually send you a payment and we'd pay 10% for someone to guarantee that. The default trade was so honest that those things vanished right away. And so that meant that all this frozen capital, roughly speaking, which were all the junk that people had lying around that someone else might want, instantly became money. And the only reason that worked was because people trusted one another. And so trust is an unbelievably powerful economic force, maybe the most powerful economic force. Anyways, it's the...
I just like that clip because the last sentence, that trust is the most powerful economic force. And I'm not an economist. I'm actually really inexperienced with mathematics. I attempt to avoid them at all costs because they make me feel stupid. But like I could keep score in a game. I can do that. Simple addition is nice. But the idea that trust is effective in the world at that level seems to me like it would be, it's similar to they will know you by your love for one another, right? Jesus saying that the identifying characteristic of his followers will be the unity that they experience because of the trust that they have with one another. And it's fascinating to me that Peterson commutes that to the modern frame of economy, and even in some strange way that brings up an unease in me about, like, you can't serve God and mammon. And mammon isn't a direct translation to money, but it is sort of the spirit of our economy, I would say. And so it might be that our economy suffers because its spirit is mammon or Moloch. And a spirit of trust could potentially be more effective in providing the environment or the energy, the volition, the spirit of the economy, so that it could be actually healthy and thriving, rather than impossible to buy a house and scary to get into a corporation and those sorts of things.
Well, I think that's even the whole thing on our dollar. In God we trust. The economic endeavor is a realm where faith is probably, especially in a fiat currency like we have, faith is the thing that backs its worth. Which, yeah, I mean, that's the dollar is only as powerful as the faith that the world puts into it. Um, but to have that, to recognize, and I think that's probably what he's getting at, that reason why economy developed the way it did in the West is due to Christian ideals. And there was like a understanding that all things come from his hand. And so, and I think it is like an attempt to um, embrace what Jesus taught us, which is, the whole entire thing. I think what's tied to that lesson, you can't serve God and money, is, I just think of the Sermon on the Mount, where it's like, do not worry about your life, such as what you'll eat, what you'll wear, such as the world concerns themselves in such matters, but trust that your Father cares about you and will provide. And so I think there was, I don't know. I mean, I can start to theorize, and not that I'm well versed in the making of our banking system, but I mean, even the whole entire making and founding of our country, it was an endeavor that required faith. It's like, okay, we're going to embark on this seemingly like the suicide mission to try to establish something that we hope for, which is the regaining of our sovereignty. Uh, and so it is like a micro of this macro that I think Jordan Peterson is kind of, elucidating, that is found in the Genesis story, in the Exodus story. Um, Obviously, that's what comes after this story, is because it's like, here's how things were generated, and then the effects of how it's corrupted is slavery, and here's also the way out of slavery, which is through divine intervention, through God, and through rediscovering Him, and by rediscovering Him, we also rediscover ourselves, what we're made to be. And so it's regaining trust in Him. And so I think that's, I don't know. I just tie that to the thought that in God we trust is on our dollar bill, because I think that is an actual substantial reality and not just a theory.
Yeah.
I think it is baked into the Western culture's conception of economy.
Yeah. I heard a conversation this week with OG Rose, Daniel Garner, and some guy who has an economist page, and I might try to get him on my podcast because he sounded really cool. But they were talking about clubs and how the club, or the sort of smaller institution group has gone away, and maybe why that is, and they associate it with the loss of givens, something that's a given, such as Christianity, something that it almost only works if you take it to be given that it is true, that it is, and they just got to this phrase like that they need, what we need is an authentic given. So something that isn't forced upon you, something, and authenticity and authority have some relationship, which I think is interesting in the realm of trust, because you have to trust an authority in order for them to operate helpfully in your life. And if they are a trustworthy authority, I think that's some form of authenticity. Like they would have a seal of authenticity, if they were good at being an authority. But anyway, the idea of an authentic given seems to me something like, I would conclude that it's Christianity, and maybe a lot of people, the people that decided to put it on the money, would also have concluded that in the past. I know there's debates about the Christianness of the founding fathers, but identifying trust as a fundamental force of our economy is interesting.
It makes me think of um, I mean, the underlying basis of how society functions is covenant. Like the covenant is the bedrock of all of society. I think I think that is a Christian, Judeo-Christian conception that, um, and it is part of our economic structure too. The concept of a guarantor or a someone to co-sign. Um,
I just wanted to throw in there, we were talking about the a priori structure idea, and it seems to me that, like you said, it's a Christian conception, and I even caveated some of my Christian claims, but it's like, I think when Peterson said, you can see that cultures that operate according to the understanding that human beings are sovereign individuals with consciousness that can afford change in the world, and bring potential into actuality, and cultures that believe that do better than cultures that don't believe that. I feel like that's one of the things that I identify so strongly with in Peterson's message, that Christianity is being proven out over centuries and millennia to be concordant with this a priori structure. And so when you say it's a Christian conception, there's a line of thinking that's like, well, that's just the way that you guys think of it. But, you know, Peterson's famous for his anti-Marxist rhetoric. It's like, yeah, because it's bad. You know, like it's ultimately ineffective and destructive to lives. And so depending on what your goals are, you know, I wouldn't do Marxism. And so that is a great example of what we're talking about. And I think Christianity, this is the difficult thing, Christianity has also morphed into something that's sort of separate. The separation of church and state perhaps is the result, or is the cause of this. But it's like the fact that we just don't think that Christianity has anything to do with the economy is some of our, like that's a big problem in our modern conception of religion and life and how they fit together.
Yeah. But the thing that I'm thinking is with the concept of a cosign, it's like with the way that the Bible explains the reality is this concept that every single creature is born into debt, if you will. I think this is why we articulate it, at least in our culture, this way, is because it speaks volumes, and it's very, I mean, it's definitely, especially today, very, it's a real authentic experience that many people are experiencing, that they're in debt just by living. And so there's no credit, you know? And so to actually, how can you restore someone's, get them back into good graces, if you will, if they are already in a place where they, their circumstances demonstrates that they're incompetent and untrustworthy, to handle value and wealth, that you need someone who is trustworthy to co-sign for them. And then you enter into this covenantal contract with an authority figure, the one who has control over the flow of currency. And so I think that even as a microcosm of what Jesus has done. And so I think that's why it's with that narrative of, okay, you're in debt and you have demonstrated you're unworthy of handling wealth. You're unfaithful. You need someone who is faithful to co-sign, who will redeem you out of this debt And so yeah, it's so interesting when he's saying that. Like it really most certainly is just the gospel narrative active in this realm that we experience every day of like, yeah, we need to have a covenant and you need to have someone who's trustworthy to co-sign on your behalf. And I think that's why that's even imprinted on our dollar. In God we trust. It's like, well, it's God who's the one who's backing. He's the figure that is proven to be faithful and who is reliable is him that we're relying on. And it's him who substantiates and keeps everything afloat. And so, um, yeah, and just to why that symbol is so important it's really is fascinating. I never thought of it like that. That like our economic structure, at least conceptually, ideally, is a reflection of the gospel. But then when you lose sight of, um, the structure that this is modeled off of, then, well, rather, I love the way he expressed that too. When you alienate yourself from the spirit that actually gives the structure life, the animating force, then the structure collapses. And when you lose sight of, um, the genesis of it, then the order, the animating force that actually is the fuel for the process of order, then comes to a halt or starts to get dilapidated. Which I love how much in Peterson's lectures he expressed that's in like every mythological story. You know, it's like there's this process of starts up, but then people lose sight of the foundation, the seed from which this process was birthed from, and then they become alienated from that source, and then eventually it falls apart, and then there's a need for reformation. But the ones who are inhabiting and empowering the structure are reluctant to um, give up the keys to the kingdom, if you will. And then that's tyranny, and then there's a tumultuous breakdown back to chaos, and then a regeneration of a restoration of what it was meant to be. And so, yeah, it's fun. It's funny how he ties in the economical thing, which is funny that you brought up Marxism, because that was the whole entire point of Marxism, was trying to deal with and trying to diagnose a problem of the woes and the things that get mankind down its luck. That it was an economical problem, and therefore we need to renovate the economic system so that there can be a fair distribution of wealth and power. Um, but it completely misses the point that it's backed by a covenant. It's not a matter of the structure that needs to change. It's the covenant that needs to be restored.
Yeah, my last best friend before you, big Marxist. So could have been me.
So these stories are trying to express what you might describe as an unchanging, transcendent reality. You know, it's something like what's common across all human experience across all time. And that's what Jung essentially meant by an archetype. And you could say, well, you know, we tend to think that what we see with our senses is real. And of course that's true, but what we see with our senses is what's real that works at the time frame that we exist in, right? And so we see things that we can touch and pick up. We see tools, essentially, that are useful for our moment-to-moment activities. We don't see the structures of eternity, especially not the abstract structures of eternity. We have to imagine those with our imagination. Well, and that's partly what these stories are doing. They're saying, well, there's forms of stability that transcend our capacity to observe, which is hardly surprising. We know that if we're scientists, right? Because we're always abstracting out things that we can't immediately observe. But there are metaphysical or moral realities or phenomenological realities that have the same nature, that you can't see them in your life by observing them with your senses, but you can imagine them with your imagination. And sometimes the things that you imagine with your imagination are more real than the things that you see. Well, numbers are like that, for example. I mean,
wait. I do want to.
Okay.
I want to keep it going for a
there's
second.
endless examples of that. And I would say, well, this is also a good way of thinking about fiction, because a good work of fiction is more real than the stories from which it was derived. Otherwise it has no staying power, right? It's distilled reality, even though in some sense it never happened. It's like, well, it depends on what you mean by happened. You know, it's a pattern that repeats in many, many places with variation. You extract out the central pattern. It's the pattern purely never existed in any specific form, but the fact that you've pulled a pattern out from all those exemplars means that you've extracted something real. And I think the reason that the story of Adam and Eve, which we'll talk about in quite a bit of detail today, has been immune to being forgotten is because it says things about the nature of the human condition that are always true. I can give you another brief example. You know, like, people have a lot of guilt. You know, there's a line of social psychology that claims that most people feel that they're better than other people. And like, I just don't buy that. That isn't what I've seen in my life. And maybe I'm a bit biased because I'm a clinical psychologist and I see more people who are overtly suffering, maybe, than people do in general. Although I'm not so sure about that, you know, because you don't have to scratch very far beneath the surface of most people's lives before you find something truly tragic. And I don't mean the sort of tragedy that you whine about. I mean, you know, your mother has Alzheimer's, or your best friend committed suicide, or you have a close relative with cancer, or you have a sick child, or, you know, there's something wrong with you, because almost everyone has at least one really terrible thing wrong with them. And if you don't, hey, you will, so, you know. So, no, that tragic sense of being is there with people all the time. And it's also the case that in my experience, like, I rarely meet someone who says, hey, you know, I'm doing everything I possibly can, I'm a hell of a guy, and I can't see how I could possibly improve, you know? You meet someone like that, you think they're narcissistic, right? And you're right. But most people don't feel that way. They feel like they could do a hell of a lot better than they are, and they're quite acutely aware of their faults, and they don't feel that they're what they should be. And you see, what happens in the story of Adam and Eve as well is that when people become self-conscious, at least that's how it looks to me, they get thrown out of paradise, and then they're in history. And history is a place where there's pain in childbirth, and where you're dominated by your mate, and where you have to toil like mad, like no other animal, because you're aware of the future. You have to work and sacrifice the joys of the present for the future constantly, and you know you're going to die, and you have all that weight on you. And to me, again, that's just, how can anything be more true than that? That's just, as far as I can tell, that's just how it is, unless you're naive beyond comprehension. There's something about your life that is echoed in that representation. And why it is that, I mean, we're such strange creatures because we don't seem to really fit into being in some sense. And that's also what's expressed in the notion of the fall. The existentialists said, well, people feel like they have a debt that they have to pay off to existence for the crime of their being, something like that. And maybe it's because we're acutely aware that we have to offer something of value to the people around us so that they can tolerate us, you know, while we're going about our business. But it seems deeper than that. It's that human beings seem to exist in a post-cataclysmic world, and that's exactly also what's represented in Genesis. And it's very interesting because, you know, in the Adam and Eve story, there's two catastrophes, essentially. There's the catastrophe that occurs when Adam and Eve wake up, which we'll talk about in detail, and become self-conscious and know that they're naked. And their eyes are open, right? So that's the terminology that's used. And to have your eyes open means to have an increment in consciousness, essentially, because eyes are associated with consciousness for human beings because we're intensely visual animals. And so the metaphor of having your eyes opened is the same as the metaphor of coming to consciousness. And as soon as Adam and Eve come to consciousness, they realize they're naked. And the classic interpretation of that is that it has something to do with sexual sin. And I don't believe that. I don't believe that that's what it means, although there are elements about that that are relevant. It's more that to realize that you're naked, it's like if you dream that you're naked on a stage in front of people, that's not a sexual dream, man, unless you're some kind of strange exhibitionist, right? It's you want to cover yourself up and get the hell off that stage as fast as possible. And so to be naked in front of a crowd is to have everyone, it's to have the judgment of the social world focused on your self-evident inadequacies. And that makes people self-conscious, and that's a real human state. It's associated with neuroticism in the Big Five trait model. But people don't like that at all. They don't like having their fragility and vulnerability exposed to the group. It's one of the two major fears of people, because one is social humiliation.
All right. I don't think he ever gets to the second point. He just keeps going.
I was gonna say, I wanted to hear the second. Yeah, I think the reason why I wanted to keep going on that point, the point of what is imagined can be more real than what you see, and that fiction can be more real than the stories that derive from, is because it's like an interesting. As I was hearing that, I was thinking about, I took this humanities class. I mentioned it. I think I've mentioned it before. It was actually I think it was a really formational experience, that humanities class, in some sense. But the class was kind of talking about idealism, which is the Platonic model of philosophy, and how Plato was kind of talking about how, with the whole theories of forms, is even what he's saying. There's fundamental layers of reality that you can't see. It takes your imagination in order to conceptualize them. That's pretty much Plato's theories of forms talk, where he's talking about. I'm not gonna explain. I've talked about it too much, but he was talking about the idea that a representation is a lesser expression than actually going to the form. And so with each step you're removed from the form.
Yeah, and you could think of it as if you were in a cave and then there was like a fire. I'm just making this up as we go, but
yeah, dude, that's
like the shadows. Really, but then the shadows are actually
fresh take
from a machine. It's not even like the real thing. That's a representation. So anyway, keep going,
dude. You're really cooking with fire, right? Cooking with gas. But I feel like with what Peterson is talking about here, it almost flies in the face of, because the class I took, the humanities, was kind of juxtaposing Platonic thought with Nietzsche, and how Nietzsche was like the first one to really revolutionize the philosophical conception on how to explain certain phenomenons, and even epistemology, how to even begin to perceive the phenomenons. But nonetheless, for Peterson to kind of talk about it, it kind of does fly in the face of idealism, where it's like almost saying, from a certain standpoint, that the representation can be more real than the direct experience of a thing, which I think that is kind of, I don't know. I really didn't. I stopped paying attention as much. I wasn't as engaged when we got into the Nietzsche area of the class, mostly because my professor's colors started to really show, and I was like, Anyways, that's another story. But I feel like that. Not that I really can adequately diagnose, but I feel like that is a Nietzschean twist on idealism, which kind of does give birth to a postmodern way of viewing the word, which is that the word is more real than reality. But at the same time, the postmodern goes so far as to say there is no narrative that is substantial. It's only as substantial as, well, as the faith you put in it. They wouldn't really quite articulate it that way, but kind of like whatever you got to tell yourself to make it work. If it works, then tell yourself whatever you need to tell yourself, which is kind of akin to the Ubermensch, I think, of like, if you can come up with a structure, come up with anything, whatever you got to come up with, if you can create something that enables you to be, then you're one step ahead of everybody else, the rest of mankind. I don't think that's completely off base in terms of faith in some word in order to generate in you a reason to live, whatever shape or form that you can trust in to get you to responsibly produce something good, then whatever works. I'm losing my train of thought here, but
I think what you said about postmodernists is consistent with Peterson's thinking on them, and he always makes a point to say the postmodernists got this exactly right, and I think you cautioned against taking it too far, and that's fine. It's like I feel as though we skip past sometimes the thing that the postmodernists got exactly right, because they weren't stupid, and it wasn't just a reactionist sort of fad or something. It marked a period of philosophy and the resultant behaviors of generations in a way that, these things you can only track in hindsight, but it was certainly more than just it's all up for interpretation and nothing really matters. So if you can just label it as something significant to you and use that fuel to navigate the world properly, then good luck with that. But there's nothing transcendent. That's where I start to become critical, is to say that there isn't something transcendent when you can obviously see, like, even just categorizing what works for you is a little bit more subjective and a little bit more sketchy maybe, but what does work? What does something that works mean? Like, I think that you're bumping into that a priori structure that we've been talking about this whole time. And if you can bump into it enough and be aware of it and become aware of it, then potentially you can actually be operating within it. I think also what Peterson was saying at the beginning of that clip a long time ago now was that we look around and we see things as tools, essentially. And then he got into how we see the material world as something that's real, but then what's really real is the a priori structure, the eternal structure that underlies those things. And that's obviously an extremely Western Christian philosophical tradition, that God is the ground of being, and even it comes through, we're talking about Genesis, like God creating the world. Like he is represented in the continued existence of creation as well. And to suggest that there's nothing transcendental, I think limits your philosophy to the here and now, to the material reality. So then you start to say, well, is it working for here and now? That's what he was referring to about the tools. We see things as tools in our immediate present moment vicinity. Like, to then be aware, as he referred to, of the future, that's a burden that you bear, but it's also the means by which you're able to project yourself into the future. And then all of a sudden, it's the way that you can treat someone with a love or live a life realistically that is eternal, right? Because Jesus came to offer us the eternal kind of life. And I think that that life is a life that is fully in the present, and every present decision has the influence of eternity. And I don't just mean time in a line. I mean like the way that things ought to be, the justice that is eternal. That's the a priori structure of things, is the way that they ought to be. And so being able to behave in the present moment in such a way that then results in something like that justice occurring in the future moment is the eternity that is true of the past, present, and future simultaneously. Which is, that's a crazy thing to say, but
as you're saying that too, it makes me think of the phrase "a living hope" in an interesting light. Yeah, it really is. That's such a. I never thought of that.
Yeah, that's
that
beautiful.
Sentence.
You should write a poem about that.
Maybe I will. But yeah, we keep on hitting on this reality of how important hope is, and to actually have a living hope that is shaped or articulated by the word. Yeah, and to think of the way of like the projecting and being consciously aware of the future, but yet the future is something that is imagined always. There's never a time where the future is not an imagination. And how we were born into hope, but then through the loss of innocence fell into despair, which is the anticipation of something dreadful. Hope is the anticipation of something good and beneficial. Despair is the dreadful anticipation of something dreadful. And so I guess it's just a matter of like whose words are you going to allow to shape your imagined reality that you're going to anticipate. And it also makes me think of I think of this verse a lot. I feel like it doesn't get enough
cross stitches. Yeah.
Consideration. Yeah. It's in Hebrews 2, and I've mentioned it a lot on this podcast too, but I'm going to mention it again because I think it's relevant. How it says that Jesus had to become like his brethren, take on the form of a man, and take on death so that he can render him powerless who has the power of death, that is the devil, and to free all those who by their fear of death were in bondage to sin. That the fear of death binds you into a way of life that falls short of the glory of God. It really is like how despair and unbelief, which really is just a belief in something contrary to what is real. So belief in the wrong words, wrong story, wrong imaginations, binds you in a way of life that is contrary to how you're made to live, and contrary to the a priori structures that are in keeping with what we were generated with, and that generates life. It begets life, and so belief in the wrong story leads you to beget dead works, dead things, produce dead fruit. But belief in living words, in the right words, and aligning yourself with the right, I guess assumptions, really. Not only not assumptions, but just with the right story, um, does produce fruit. Is a fruitful, and that's the whole thing that you're describing earlier too. Is that like you'll know them by their fruit. You'll know the how credible the author that you are allowing to authorize your way of thinking is, judging by the fruit of you acting upon your belief in their words.
Is associated in some sense with the emergence of conscious being, and so that's another echo of that notion. And the particular phrasing of the story also is important, because it's again that God said, right? So that's the use of that word, and that's the active element of the structure that gives rise to, that gives order to chaos. It's something like that. So it's like the spirit of the structure manifests itself and produces the fundamental divisions of experience. That's what's being presented here.
Okay, so I wanted to talk about this because I keep trying to talk about it, and maybe I just need to write it out for 10,000 words or something, and then I'll be able to say it more clearly. But that's what I've been trying to say. Nobody will remember, but I've stumbled my way around this vision that I've had of the word in this very scene being some structure a priori that then is expressed into being, and it's like it fits like a glove or something like that. Like it's so hard to conceive even of the scene in Genesis 1 where God said, "Let there be light," or God, is in the beginning hovering over the waters of formlessness and voidness. And but that scene struck me 6 months ago, and I tried to lay that out on this podcast, like some form of structure. And this is what he's saying, like the structure. This is the spirit of that structure, speaking, moving towards and shaping the potentiality of the world into all of these categories of experience. And so if you imagine like light and dark and earth and water and the sky, and filling those places with animals of all different kinds, like that's what he's talking about, the categories of experience, the birds, the animals of the field, and the fish in the sea. Like that is self-expression, just like any form of art is self-expression. Unfortunately, that has led to massive deterioration in modern art and its value. It's probably still valuable, but the quality of it is diminished recently. But art has always been the expression of the perspective of the artist. And so there's something to that in this creation narrative that I find incredibly elucidating about the nature of God. And yeah, I mean, I'm just a silly Protestant. Like I've got no backup for any of these stories other than that they're 100% true and real video camera footage, transcribed in Genesis 1, and this is how it scientifically occurred. But like, I'm sure the Jewish tradition has so much glorious connections to make all throughout each story with, and you can see here, this is another representation of Eden, and you can see that that nature plays a role in this story in a way that is indicative of God's creation and his role and participation in the sustenance of life in the world. And anyway, I'm kind of whining now at this point about how that's not a part of my tradition. I wish it was.
Yeah. I do find it interesting in terms of like the separating, the setting apart, setting aside for the purpose, for a purpose, um, and each sector, each category of experience. I love that phrasing of it, like the establishment of different domains to be set aside for certain purposes and certain creatures' activities and our activity to be um, to divide all of the chaos and categorize all the chaos and then to establish a garden, which is even a further division upon the land for the purpose of mankind, still leaves the possibility of experience to be um, it's still possible to inhabit and to attempt to expand the domain of operation if mankind would so choose. But at the same time, it's just the free will aspect where it's like it isn't a prison. They're permeable walls. I think the last podcast I was on, we're talking about that concept. But the purpose of setting boundaries with intention in mind, but yet leaving the possibility of allowing another's intentions to contradict yours is a fascinating way of thinking. That's just an interesting archetype of thinking about the creation story of like categorizing experience. It's a fascinating thing. And even as I was thinking about that, like where I'm at right now, it's like I wake up and I have so much possibility of like, okay, what domain do I want to inhabit and operate in and experience? And instead of choosing one that is actually conducive to an eternally beneficial end, I decide to inhabit a domain that gives the illusion of, I guess, freedom, but really it's actually more binding than the category of experience that for some reason I perceive as maybe it's not explicitly thought this way, but I don't perceive as that domain to be the area to operate in order to have abundant living. I instead attempt to find life in a domain, in a category of experience that it was never set apart to work towards, with that intention in mind. It's like a dead end. It's a cul-de-sac rather than an avenue or a highway. And that's like every other category of experience that is paved by any other agent. But the road to life is narrow, like, and it's like walking the path that God paved, that He set apart, that He laid for the purpose of getting us to where He, well, I guess predestined us to get to, if you want to express it that way. But we have the freedom to choose our own destiny, type of thing.
Yeah, He like categorized us to experience that. Something like that.
Yeah.
So we're not adapted for security and utopia. We're adapted for a certain amount of security because, we are vulnerable, but mostly we want to have one foot out where we don't know what the hell is going on, because that's where you're alert and alive and tense and with it. And I believe this, and I believe it actually has something to do with the hemispheric structure of the physiology of your brain, is because the right hemisphere looks roughly adapted to what you don't know, and the left hemisphere, and this is an oversimplification, but a useful one, is adapted to the world that you do know, and the right place for you to be is halfway between them. Because and you can tell that. That's what's so cool. And this tells you that this is actually reality that's manifesting itself to you. You know, that sense of active engagement you have in the world when things are working well for you, where you're where you should be at the right time. You're alert and on top of things and engaged, and you don't have much of a sense of time, and the sense of the tragedy of life sort of recedes. And that's when you've got one foot where it's secure and one foot out in the unknown, and your brain signals to you that you're in the right place by making what you're doing meaningful. And that sense of meaning is actually a neurophysiological signal that you've got the forces of the cosmos properly balanced in your being at that moment. And that's why it feels so good. And then, well, what else could it possibly be? I mean, our brain is capable of looking beyond our vision. That's what it's for. And that sense of engagement, there's no reason to assume that that's anything but a real signal. And you can reduce it. You could say, well, the problem with being where you know only is that you don't know everything. And that's going to be a problem in the future. And the problem with being where you know nothing is that's just too much, man. Like, you go into panic mode, and because anything can happen there and you can't handle it. So you got to mediate between those two things. You want to be secure enough so that your physiology isn't revving out of control, and you want to be out there in the unknown enough so that you keep updating yourself constantly. And that's the place where information flow is maximized. And you know that because that's where you are when you're having a really interesting conversation with someone, or you're gripped by a book, or you're really into a movie, or maybe something that you do as apart from your work, or maybe even in your work, you're into it. And that's because you are in the right place at the right time, and your whole nervous system is signaling that to you. And I would say that's the sort of place that you should be all the time. Of course, you can't be, because no one's perfect, but that's the recreation of paradise on earth. It's something like it, because you are in the right place at the right time when that is happening, subject to certain, what would you say, restrictions that we can talk about later. Well, that's what this guy's doing. And that's, I would say, akin to the action that God is taking when he's transforming the chaos of potential into habitable being. And it's the sort of thing that human beings are supposed to act out.
I just think, for me, that, there's so much there, obviously. He packs a lot into a paragraph, but
yeah.
I love the oversimplification of the brain thing, because it makes me think of Ian McGilchrist and, anybody that's reading McGilchrist who's a double PhD guy and like did the jobs, not just like had the PhDs and knew the stuff. He was a psychiatrist and a neurosurgeon. He talks about the way that the right hemisphere is supposed to be the master of the left hemisphere. And it was making me think of, the lateralization that we talk about with hemispheres. And the physiognomy is there's a little connective tissue between the two hemispheres called the corpus callosum. And it's how they exchange information, each hemisphere. And it's super fascinating that this is even true at all, that the right hemisphere has things that it does specifically and more of the processing in regards to things like, even just what Peterson simplified it to. Let's just use those terms. In regards to the idea that your right hemisphere is processing the things that you don't know. It's like engaging with them. It's prodding them, like trying to get at what is this thing, And then your left hemisphere is dealing with things that you do know in a way that, like, they don't share those burdens fully. It's more localized to the left and right hemisphere, respectively. That's very interesting to me. But then also, I know that we've kind of done away with this idea But like it used to be thought that you were a left-brained person or a right-brained person, similar to handedness, maybe even associated with it. And I think now that's kind of been proven to not be the case. But I do think that it's represented in our culture in the way that we trust the information of the right hemisphere or the left hemisphere. Right hemisphere being associated with like intuition, right? Intuition is something that you really can't prove that. Though Joe Rogan has a lot of guys on that are in the field of trying to prove it materially. It's a difficult thing to pin down. And so, anyway, I just wanted to say, it feels to me like that being in the middle, like what Peterson was saying, being at that point of the corpus callosum, the thing that exchanges information between the two of them, that is, I mean, that is the garden, is what he said, but it's actually true. Like if you just think for 1 second about the marriage of heaven and earth and the symbols of like a Venn diagram or whatever of heaven and earth, and the overlap being the ideal garden, the paradise, it's ultimately represented in Christ, the incarnation, fully God and fully man. But it's like that left hemisphere dealing with the things that you know for sure. It just seems so much like the scientific materialism of our age. Like that's the entire project. Know enough stuff that you don't have to know anything else. And like scientists don't think of it that way because they want to find out more things because that's fun, like he was describing. But religious people, this is the battle between religion and science, and it's like religious people will say, well, yeah, I mean, we know this stuff about the stuff that we don't know, you know? And that concept is, I think it's fundamentally Gnostic, actually, like, or spiritually, it has the same spirit of Gnosticism, where you try to separate the things that you know, the world, from the things that you don't know, heaven. But then there's that secret knowledge aspect of Gnosticism that creeps into all these religious conversations where it's like, well, yeah, I mean, we don't really know what heaven is like, but we do know how to get there, or we don't really know, how to get there, but we know that we're gonna get there. You know, these types of like rationalizations of things that you actually don't know. And I think what it is to me is that you have to experience them. You have to experience the kingdom of heaven as it is at hand here in your life in order for you, like, you have to have a relationship with Jesus. This is what I've been saying this episode. You have to be known by him and know him, experience him in a way that allows you to partake in his nature and his structure for your life and all of these things in a way that when you reduce what you don't know to what you know, and you make that bifurcation and you don't stay in the middle there where they're exchanging information and you've got 1 foot in what you know and 1 foot in what you don't know, then I think you're closing yourself in. We've talked about this on the podcast recently. Like the Ouroboros is the enclosure of a cult or of certainty, and that's the snake eating its tail, and that's certainty. And so then what breaks it out is the willingness to experience. Like that's the only chance you have of getting that snake to stop eating its tail is to get it something else to chase and to eat. And if you do that, then it creates a spiral upward rather than a continuous loop that is enclosed and ultimately dead and all of the things that we've been talking about. Like the spirit of the animal is to consume. So you must let it encounter something other than itself. And it's weird to use snakes because most people think they're evil or whatever, but it's like it's just it's an analogy. But I think you could use the self and the other as an example of this. Like if you're enclosed to yourself, you're not capable of relationship. And that's obviously at the heart of everything that we've been saying throughout this whole episode, that you must be able to encounter the other in a way that is aligned with the structure of their otherness, you know? And I don't know how to avoid like the ultimate unity of like we all come from God, we're all God's children. I kind of think that there's truth in that. I just don't know how to separate it from like oneness consciousness stuff. But like it is in our nature to be whole in relationship. I think that's kind of the whole Christian story. And so then when we're enclosed within ourselves by this self-consciousness and sin and the fall and etc., those are many different images of the same thing, then we suffer greatly the burden of existence. But in relationship with the unknown of the other, then it allows us to balance, to be balanced, because there's so much unknown in us that we avoid at all times because that's scary. Let's just deal with what I know about myself, you know? And even that, what you know about yourself can be scary as hell, and you don't want to deal with it because of the unknown that sort of underlies that.
Nothing. Because that's a really good question, you know? And I thought about two things in relationship to that. And one is, well, maybe it depends on how it is that you are, right? Because it could be that there are ways of being in the world that justify the world. And there are ways of being in the world that make the world unbearable. And I believe that the narrative that runs through the biblical stories is precisely a dialogue between those two types of being. And the optimistic part of the story is that being requires limitation and suffering. There's no escape from that. But there are modes of being that allow that to be perhaps even more than tolerable. Perhaps there are modes of being that allow that to be good. And it's a straight and narrow road. It's a very difficult road to tread. So I think, well, that's possible. You know, I'm not an optimist by nature. But that's one of the things that I've conceptualized and read about that I actually find plausible, because it's certainly the case, everyone knows this, that there are ways that you can act that make things worse. Everyone knows that. And so if that's the case, there has to be the opposite, right? There has to be ways that you could act that make things better. And obviously you can act in ways that make things really way worse. And so the question is, well, are there ways that you can act that make things really much better? And I think that's the question is, can we have our cake and eat it too? Can we have the being that requires limitation and suffering and also simultaneously transcend that by our mode of being? And I believe that the biblical stories, and perhaps not only the biblical stories, but the biblical stories are one of the human imagination's best attempts to address and answer that question. That's what the entire story is about. So the first of it is the catastrophe of the collapse of self-consciousness and the entrance of humanity into history. And the rest of it is, okay, now we're in history. Now we know that we're going to die. We know about our mortality. We're conscious of our own being. Is there a mode of acting in the world that allows that to be justifiable, or maybe even more, that allows that to be triumphant? And then I would also say, maybe it's worth finding out, you know. That's the other thing that's so interesting, because you've got this short time on Earth, and there's lots of things that are very, very difficult to contend with, and you have the problem of tolerating yourself even in all your insufficiency. And one of the things that seems to me to be the case is that if you adopt a sufficiently profound mode of being, if you attempt to do that, then the mere act of lifting up that weight is enough to justify the fact that you're insufficient and mortal and bound by tragedy. And I believe that, and I believe people believe that, because if you watch how people act, they look for people they admire. And they do admire people, right? It's a natural phenomenon. You see it starting with children. Children admire and then they imitate. And we look to people who seem to be able to bear the burden of being in a heroic manner, and there's something inside of us that calls to that, and that makes us want to mimic that and to follow it. And I think that that's the deepest and most profound of instincts, and I think it's right. And even if you're not so convinced on the positive end, you know, because it's more difficult to be convinced of the positive, you can certainly be convinced on the negative end, because there are ways of being that are so brutal and so reprehensible that merely to read about them is enough to traumatize you. And I think that if you're a person who hasn't lost their soul completely, you can't help but encounter stories like that and shudder away from them. And, you know, Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who was the person who did most to unmask the absolute horrors of communist totalitarianism, said that he believed that the Nuremberg judgments were the most important event of the 20th century, and that was the judgment at the end of World War II, that there were certain actions that no one was to undertake, no matter what their cultural background was, because they were, let's say, crimes against humanity. That there was such a thing as universal evil. And you can debate that, you know, I mean, and people certainly have, but the problem is if you debate that, then you have to say that there are conditions under which the sorts of things that happened, say, in the concentration camps, which would be the gassing of children after their torture and their forcible removal from their parents and all the terrible things that went along with that, that's just okay. It's just an opinion. It's just something that happened, and there are circumstances under which that's justifiable. If there's no transcendent good and evil underneath that argument, it's only a matter of practicality. And it seems to me that that's not the right conclusion to draw. That's how it seems to me, and that's what Solzhenitsyn concluded when he looked at the Nuremberg trials. So the notion that it was good, well, even if you don't believe that, and you know, because maybe it's not as good as it could be, I would say it's incumbent on you as someone who participates in the process of furthering creation to act as if it could be good, at least, and to further that with all of your efforts. Partly because what the hell else do you have to do that could possibly be better than that could possibly justify your existence more than that? And you know perfectly well, if you...
Yeah, I think the idea of admiration is one worthy of isolating and giving space to air out because it is a fascinating thing of like, that's something that struck me while I was in high school, just the idea of choosing role models, and like how that comes about, what motivates someone to, I don't even know if it's really like, I was listening to another lecture of Jordan Peterson, one that he's putting out new ones from his last tour, and it was the one about like finding a problem, or one like something about like the problems that won't let you go. I think it was that lecture, and I forget. There's a certain way he expressed it that really struck me. I forgot what the word was. There was a certain word that he broke down the etymology of, and I never really recognized it. And it was funny because I was at a place where I was reading in John, and it's that section where he's talking about, I'm the good shepherd and my sheep hear my voice. Any other voice, a voice of a stranger, they will not, be drawn to because they don't recognize it. I really wish I remembered the word. But he was talking about the etymology of it is when he was describing the process of how a hypothesis comes about, like how scientists come up with a hypothesis, and he's just saying that like, no one really just comes up with it; it just like grips them. And the word he was using was, he's talking about the etymology of it, which I really wish I remembered the word, but it was like when the light is shed on it, and that it's not by your choice. It's not something that you choose. It just grips you. And so to tie that aspect of experience, that like when something resonates with something in you, and like the thought enters your mind and you're drawn to something that's not really a voluntary process. It's something that kind of just, I guess it just kind of happens. And so in terms of applying that thought with role models, when you see someone embarking on their life in a way that stands out to you, and then you begin to model it, that is, I don't know, it's an interesting phenomenon. And I think it's tied to what Jesus was talking about there. Is like there's just certain people that they're wired to, when that thing enters their sense perception, it just grabs them. And so like when my sheep hear my voice, it's like there's certain people where like they hear it and they're just drawn. And there's other people that hear it and they just aren't, it doesn't grab them for some reason. That can happen with any figure. Any figure can depend on who you are. Anyone can be your role model. But
even
in
like
particular,
a relative or the postman, or like these people that just are in your life, in your sphere of influence, like, or vice versa. You're in their sphere of influence.
Yeah, but then there's other people that it just won't grip them. It's, I find it similar to, even there's a passage in 2 Corinthians that talks about, we give out the fragrance of the knowledge of Christ, and to those who are being saved, it's the fragrance of life, and those who are dying, it's the fragrance of death. And yeah, and that same thing that Jesus is saying there, he says like, I am the gate, and anyone who enters through me is a shepherd, which is a fascinating idea, which is a hard thing to interpret. But I do think it's akin to the whole "you're the light of the world" idea we talked about earlier. That, like, in a sense, when you enter into this way of life, you take on a responsibility that you are responsible to, be that source of inspiration for another. And even inspiration, that word means like to be breathed on by a spirit. And so it's like the spirit in you, you are a vehicle that spirit can inspire someone else, that they then admire something about you and your character and your nature. And since we are partaking in the nature of God, they glorify your Father in heaven, like they recognize that you are modeling your role model, your teacher. And so it's just that, I guess that's like the whole apostolic succession type thing too, where it's like there's a whole line of models and figures and that you are modeling after, and it all goes back to the ungenerated progenitor of all living things. And so that's an interesting thought to think of like something that gives your life meaning and enables you to be in a way that is actually good, which good equals meaningful. That's your responsibility as a human being to be that, to be a source of inspiration, a figure that is admired, someone who's bearing their cross heroically, and that others see that and are inspired by your heroic mode of being. That's a really cool way of thinking about being. It's cool that he's extracting that from Genesis, from this first chapter of Genesis. It's just fascinating.
I know that's why we're doing this series, because it literally changed my life, and I am enjoying so greatly coming back to these, because there's so much material, and because it's spoken, I feel like, and because we live in a written world, it's harder to remember specifics about these lectures. I just always tell people like, that's why I believe in God, is because of these lectures. And what you were just saying, it reminds me of what I was trying to say earlier about, like, we've both said it today, that it's about having a relationship with God such that God lives within you. So he's the spirit of the structure that makes up you, which is a unique manifestation of him and his creativity and his design and his character, because we're all images of God in the world. And so in order to fully be the way that you are, there is some participation of his spirit within you that needs to take place. And so it's like it's not just that we are created by him and set loose, but that his desire is to participate within what it is that he has created, including ourselves. And so yes, it is an exciting and interesting way of being, but like the being, capital B, that is afforded us is only possible, I think, with him. He knows like the ins and outs. He knows how to handle the self that we have been given by him. And yeah, I just think that that's incredibly exciting and super fun stuff. Okay, final scene, clip, and here we go.
So the hypothesis is that God is an abstracted ideal, formulated in large part to dissociate the ideal from any particular incarnation or man or ruler. And the underlying idea there too is that when the ruler becomes the ideal, the state turns into the biblical Egypt. And the biblical Egypt is a tyranny. And so there's a very, very solid idea in the Old Testament that I think took people, God only knows how long to figure out, that if you confused the notion of sovereignty with the current sovereign, then your culture immediately degenerated into a totalitarian state and turned to stone. And that was deadly. Then you were slaves. And then the thing was going to collapse as well. Like, no matter how big and grandiose, as soon as the ruler became the concrete incarnation of the ideal, there was no distinction between the man and the divine notion of the ideal, then the society was doomed. And I think that that's I think that's true. It's as simple as that. And I think we saw more than enough evidence of that in the 20th century, and we're certainly seeing the same thing repeating itself now. When the ruler becomes the ideal, the state turns into the biblical Egypt, and the biblical Egypt is the archetypal tyranny. So, what is God like?
I don't know if it's the best place to end the episode, but I do think that this is an incredibly important issue at hand. I talked about authority earlier and the way that I think it's associated with this relationship that we're talking about, to be inhabited by the spirit of the structure that you are designed after. Like, we're images of God, meaning we represent him. He is this a priori structure that is, his name, I am. And as such, our being is only possible because of him. And then its truest form of being or something is, I'm sorry, it's all weird right now, is possible by his taking up residence within us in a cooperative way. This is not a possession. This is not he tells you everything to do and you just do whatever he says. Although some people do enjoy those experiences with God. This is a cooperative endeavor. And that doesn't mean that your sovereignty or your agency allows you to step out of line and take the place of the structure. You are not the structure, right? Your structure is representative of God's being. And so in order to flourish, in order to do well, in order to be good, there is an alignment that must take place. And I think the only possible way for that alignment to take place is through the sort of relational coordination that is interacting with the other in a spirit of agapic love, probably is a good qualifier as well. And so when he talks about the spirit of sovereignty being conflated with the material man sovereign in a culture, and the way that it ultimately destroys the governing structure, the city, the nation, all of these things, they all come crumbling down when the person becomes the ideal. Because I think it's because we're fractals, something like that. We're fractally representative of God. And so we are only partially representative, although in some ways maybe fully, but we are not a perfect representation of God. Only Jesus was that. And I think the only way that Jesus was that, because he had a body like anybody else, virgin birth notwithstanding maybe, was because he was perfectly aligned in this way where he had that trust and that hope and that like living hope, the present in the moment experience of what is hoped for and trusted in that person of God, in the spirit of the structure of things. And so it's complicated, and I feel like I didn't clarify anything of what I was trying to say there, but that alignment comes through relationship with the spirit of the structure of things. That's what the Bible is talking about. That's what Peterson is saying. And that's what I'm trying to talk about, because I don't know. I think that in many ways we can conflate our doctrines with the ideal, and then we suffer the consequences of that. We can conflate our traditions with the ideal and suffer the consequences there. We can conflate celebrity pastors or the Pope or the liturgy, or, every different group of Christians does this thing. And every group of people does this thing. Science is a commonly held ideal that I don't think it's an ideal. I think it's okay as long as you understand there is a separation between what is actually and truly ideal, the ideal, and what is a mediation of that ideal in the world. And so, yeah, those are my closing thoughts. Last words? You could say a lot of them, but
Yeah. The word that I was talking about earlier was phenomenon.
yes.
And the etymology
A
for
shining
phenomenon
forth.
was, yes, that which appears or is seen. And so when something phenomenal occurs, it is enlightening. It is something not seen before, but now it's appeared to you. And so I think that's even with this lecture. I mean, it's a phenomenal lecture because it is. I think that's the whole thing too, about like the fresh take on something that is so like of an anchor, of something foundational. It honestly is like the embodiment of what he's even describing here, where it's like to actually get to what is so phenomenal about the book of Genesis. It's because I think what is mistaken as phenomenal about Genesis is the localization of the ideal. And so it's like it's very meta in the sense of like, as he's describing the whole regenerative process and what needs to happen in order to liberate the mind from a tyranny. And the weaponization of a structure, maybe not even weaponization, that sounds like it has a motive.
Yeah.
The motivation isn't to destroy. It's more like the mishandling or the misappropriation of the structure, the misidentification, even when he's talking here, the misidentification as the structure being the ideal rather than the spirit being the source of generation that cultivates the category of experience that is ideal, that sanctifies and consecrates the zone of proximal development, which is that area of 1 foot in the left, 1 foot in the right, 1 foot in the known, 1 foot in the unknown. It's like and I think that's what makes a phenomenon a phenomenon. It's like it has to, if it grips you, it's because it can be tied to an area of experience where you do have some type of competency, so you're able to actually have the capacity to detect something in this category of experience. I'm thinking allegory of the cave type rhetoric, where it's like you've actually ventured into an area where you've gotten your bearings, where at first it was discombobulating and you're unable to perceive anything in this area. But now you have enough experience in this area that you're able to perceive new things about it, where not everything is so new that it's overwhelming. You have your bearings about you in this area. But now something has appeared to you in this area that is new, and it's kind of tied to the whole schema concept, where in order for you to actually grow in your understanding, it has to be linked to an already established schema in your perception of the grand scheme of things. And so to tack on a new form of knowledge in this domain, it comes via a phenomenon that just grips you. Comes to you hearing the voice, whereas before you were unable to detect that one voice out of the whole entire echo chamber of many voices that are much louder than the still small voice of God. And so I think that's why this lecture is so phenomenal. It's because it is causing something that is otherwise overlooked to be brought to light, be brought at the forefront of our considerations when reconsidering this age-old story that we do take as a given, but in a way that is so subtle. Like that, this narrative has given birth to the way of life that we have in the West, but we're so far removed from the conception, the genesis of it, that
the spirit
we
of
are
it.
The spirit of it, yeah. But even like we're prone to mistake what agent is the author of this structure, and so
Yeah.
it's phenomenal.
And that's why
my
we wore our
closing thought.
sunglasses.
It's too bright.
Yeah. It's shining.
That's great.
All right. Well,
this has been great.
This has been great. Thank you for spending the time with me. And if anybody's still listening, let me know why we wore our sunglasses in the comments, and then I'll know that you got to the end.
Mm-hmm.